So for today's Maker Monday, we are going to do turned edge applique in shapes. So a while back, I showed you how to do this technique with circles, which is easy. This is a little bit step up. I personally, when I do applique, I like my edges to be really clean instead of raw. You can totally do fusible applique. You can do needle turned applique. I've given you a video showing you a technique to do a needle turned applique. But this way, we're going to take a somewhat simple shape, but that has curves to it. And we're going to show you how to make it look needle turned. Okay. What I'm using is Fusible Power Mesh. It's a cutaway embroidery stabilizer. Cutaway is important because that makes it tough. Fusible is important because then you don't have to pin it down. And the power mesh part is important because it's very lightweight and you can see through it. So I took a chunk of that, and I actually used a 20-inch roll so I'd have a little bit wider bit. I'm going to take my cutaway, and it doesn't matter which direction you fold it at this point, but we're going to make layers, so we only have to cut this once. So I'm just going to kind of fold this in squares. You're going to have to kind of play with this based on what shape you're making. But since I kind of figured this out beforehand, I know that I can fold this twice and then fold it again. And that gives me, what, 8 layers of stabilizer. And then I'm going to test and make sure that my template will fit on that square, which it does. I could even turn it this way if I want to have more space. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to do. So I'm using a color thread that's really easy to see, just for the sake of demoing. I'm going to start from the folded edge because it's less likely to move. This is really stable and flat. And this doesn't have to be perfect. We're just going to hold it still. And I'm going to sew through all 8 layers of my stabilizer. Now this is a weird extra little move, but so that I don't have to pin this, I'm just going to go into the middle of my block or my square, and I'm just going to take about 3 or 4 stitches. I'm not going to tie it off. I want to have long tails because I want to pull this out later. Okay, so once we have our 8 layers put together, we're going to cut out our template. So I have made a heart-shaped template on a bit of template plastic. I've also given myself a middle line just for reference. You don't actually have to have that. I'm going to take my template and I'm going to put it on the square. So again, we could put it this way if we choose to. Doesn't really matter. You just want to make sure that your template is inside the sewing line. So just for fun, so that I have a little bit more room, I'm going to turn it sideways. I'm using a friction pen. You can use whatever you want for this because we're going to cut this out and you only have it on the top piece. But just for fun, since maybe this is going to show on something somewhere, I'm going to use a friction pen because this is going to go away. And here's the fun part. I only have to trace out 1 heart to get 8 hearts. If you want to make more, if you feel like your cutting skills are good enough to cut through more than 8 layers, then you can do that. That's fine. I like the Karen K. Buckley scissors for this because the serrated edge makes for cutting through these layers really easy. Now a tip when you're cutting a shape, if you keep your scissors straight and turn the fabric, you get a smoother cut. And you see how I'm using sort of the V part of the scissors to cut? I'm not trying to snip it, because see, if I try to snip it, it doesn't go anywhere. So use the top part of your scissors to cut these curves, and you'll get a much smoother shape. All right, so now we've cut out 8 perfect hearts. I can take this thread and just kind of pull it out, and now we didn't even have to pin it. So now we have all of our little hearts, right? Make as many of these hearts as you're going to want to do, or circles, or squares, or triangles, or whatever shapes you want to make. You can make any shape that you like. One side of this is fusible. The fusible side is just a little bit shiny. Can you see the shine on there? It's a really subtle shine because the fusible is really subtle itself. It's a really lightweight thing. And see how clear and easy to see through that is? The reason I like that for this technique is it's really easy to fussy cut what I want to cut, because when I put this down on my fabric, it just sort of disappears. So if I want to, let's say I want to center my heart, I can fold this down the middle. I could even fold it up this way if I wanted to. If I really wanted to know where the middle of this heart was, I could fold it like that. I could make a little mark with my friction pen. Okay. Now, let's say I want to make the same thing over and over again. Let's say I want to fussy cut this same red flower over and over again. I can take my little point, that little point that I made in the middle of my heart, and then I can pick a point on the flower and line up the heart. Okay, so if I want to get really particular about this, I could take that circle, and let's say I'm going to line it up with this top little circle right here. So I could line that little dot up with that. Then if I want to be really particular, I could make sure that I match the bottom of the heart with the stem. Okay, so if I do that, I could make the same heart multiple times without really having to worry about too much. All right, so here's one of those times where I did it backward, and now I'm going to point out my mistake. You need to face the Fusible to the fabric, to the right side of the fabric. Okay, so when I do the next one, I will fix that. But yeah, I just messed up. So here's one of those things where, oh look, there's a mess up that Angie made.
Reality quilting.
Reality quilting. Let's say I want to have a red circle or a red flower, and then I want to have a green one. Now when I'm putting these together, make sure the Fusible, the shiny side, is up. Now if I try to do that same thing with my green one here, look, it goes off my fat quarter. That's not going to work. But if I come to this green one over here, and I line up my dot there, and I turn the point of my heart to be on the stem there, now I can make that shape again. Okay, so however you want to fussy cut your shapes, you can do that. Before we go to the machine though, if you don't want to deal with all of this fabric in your machine, you don't have to. You can just sort of rough cut around the fabric to get your shapes. I prefer doing this because then the weight of the fabric isn't pulling in my machine, and I'm going to get better results in the sewing part. I'm not going to cut these super detailed. I'm just sort of going to rough cut them, and then we're going to take them to the machine and sew them. I always like to use these videos to show you features on your brother's sewing machine. So I'm going to use a 1/4" piecing foot because it's got that little edge on it. You can use the foot that doesn't have the edge on it if that's what you have. That's fine. I'm also going to use the pivot feature on my machine. This picture right here, whether it's on your screen or it's on the body of your machine, this little picture with the foot and the needle, that's your pivot function. When you're sewing shapes, this is very helpful. All right, so when we're sewing this down, couple of tips. Since I have sort of an odd shape, I'm going to start on what I call the straightaway, because we're not going to start in a curve. We're going to start on a straight spot. You can do a tie-off stitch if you want to. I don't necessarily. But since I'm going to use the edge of that 1/4" foot to stitch, I'm going to have a consistent seam allowance. Now, one of the things you may not realize about your 1/4" foot is this little line right here in the edge of your foot is a 1/4" from where your needle is. So if you use the foot and you stitch right up to where your stabilizer ends, and your ending point of your stabilizer matches up with that little line, when I turn my foot, look, it lines up perfectly on the other side. We're going to continue to stitch all the way around our shape. All right, so we're just going to keep sewing all the way around this heart. Now here's a hot tip I forgot to give you. Normally when I'm sewing a heart shape or something that has a what I call a cleavage move, I'll take my friction pen and I'll make a line right there in that space. So that little line is going to give you a reference point of where to stop sewing. Okay, so if I mark that here and I make it long enough that it's going to be into my sewing field, so as I'm sewing, I can't see the edge of the heart anymore underneath my foot, but I can see that bright blue mark. So if my needle goes down right where that bright blue mark is, I'm still going to have a 1/4 inch away from the edge. Just take 2 or 3 stitches at a time and turn it a little, and turn it a little, and turn it a little. Eventually you'll get to where your hands and your brain just know how to go around the curve. But if you're new to this, don't think you can do that right away. All right, so I'm going to show you that again. We have our piece, ditch our pin. Again, I'm going to use my Karen K. Buckley scissors to trim the excess fabric off. Then I really like these sharp pointed scissors. They're very sharp and the point can get down into really sharp points like this. So I'm going to snip right there in that fold, or where the point of the heart is, and then just about every 1/4 inch or so around what I call the shoulders. And I don't even get right up next to the thread, but this is one of the reasons I use embroidery stabilizer instead of like a clothing interfacing. It's a lot stronger and it can handle the abuse that I'm about to put it through. And then I cut some of the fabric off of the point there, okay? Then take the fabric and separate it from the stabilizer. Make sure you have them completely separated from each other because we're going to cut through just the stabilizer. And I'm going to cut a pretty big opening because then I don't have to finagle this too hard to get it to turn. I like using hemostats for this step, so I'm going to put it into here. I'm going to grab one of the shoulders and pull it through the hole. And since the opening is quite large, I don't really have to fuss with getting it through there. Since I'm not going to top stitch or close this or anything, it's all going to be on the back. It doesn't really matter that you have this big gaping hole in the back. Okay, so we're going to turn everything right way out. I'm going to use my precision turning tool to then poke the corners out. This is the other, I was just about to say you don't poke through the ends, but you know, sometimes you do. We're going to poke this around through the edges. That's why it's important not to cut it too small. And turn the shoulders around. So I can push pretty firmly with this turning tool because it has a rounded end. It won't push through that seam allowance. But just keep sort of folding the edges over with your turning tool until you get it all nice and smoothed out. Okay, so I've already done that with my little yellow birdie. I use a silicone pressing sheet for this step. We poke our edges out. We iron them down. You can use steam in this step because that's going to make your edges roll out really nice and you get this nice smooth point. All right, so now I've cut a white square just slightly bigger than what I want it to finish at. I make it bigger because then I can kind of center it after it's done, or maybe I want to put it on point, maybe I want to move it around. But if you want to center your piece on the square, fold your square and fold your square and find your middle. And then if you want to put your heart on point, you can turn it this way and have a reference. If you want to make it square, you can line the point of your heart and the tip of your heart in the middle like that. I would recommend folding your heart in half, finding the middle of it as well. And then you can line up this side and this side, and this point and this point, and you can get it right where you want it. Now we've used this Fusible product so that we don't have to pin this down and then take it to the machine. We can just fuse it to the piece of fabric. So the Fusible that's in this product really likes steam and it likes to get hot. So if you're ironing it down and it doesn't stick right away, just be patient. And eventually, it doesn't take that long. It's just not going to do it in the very instant that you put the iron to it. But it will stick on there, okay? You can press it from the back too if you want to make sure everything's really nice and flat. All right, but now I don't have to pin this to take it to my iron. It's stuck to my piece of fabric. All right, now I have shown you in videos before how to do the blanket stitch to stitch this down, but I'm going to go ahead and show you one more time. All right, so I'm going to take my 1/4 inch foot off. We're going to put our J foot or any open zigzag foot on. I'm going to use my blanket stitch, it's an applique stitch. It looks like this on your machine. See how it's got those straight lines and then the lines hop in? Since I'm going to stitch from the outside, that's the direction that I want it to be. My machine will actually give you an example of what your stitch is going to look like. If your machine doesn't do this, I recommend stitching it out to see what you're actually gonna get. I can change the width on mine. I kind of want it to look like it was stitched on purpose, so I'm gonna make my stitches hop in just a little bit more, okay? So now when we go to applique this down, this is another time that your pivot is really nice to have. And this line in the middle of your J foot here, if you drop your foot and you line that little crack in your foot up with the edge of your piece, your stitch will stitch right around that edge. Okay, so when I drop my foot, it's dropped right there. Can you see that? That it's dropped right there on the edge of my applique. Now the other reason I like this stitch is because it takes 3 small stitches and then hops in and back out again. So it's almost invisible around the edge of your applique. So when I get to the end of my heart here, I can use the pivot and I can go back around the corner. Now, hot tip, if you want to get good at an applique stitch, just practice it. Make sure that whenever you're turning, that your needle is in the out position. So it's going to hop in and it's going to go out. Make sure that anytime you stop and turn anything, you're in the out position. That's a finished block. I'm going to square this down to a size that I like. I don't probably want quite as much white around the outside. I'm probably going to square this down to about 5 inches. And then I'm just going to sew them to each other and make a pillow. So what we used for this was we used template plastic. We used Fusible power mesh. I used a hemostat. I used my stitch turning tool. I used my fine tipped snipping scissors and my Karen K. Buckley scissors. I think that's what I used. Oh, and a silicone pressing sheet. So I will put all of that stuff in the description. So if you think you want to test this out, you can. All right, see you later.